typical day in the news cycle, I think it's sort of akin to the weather on any given day. There's like a naturally occurring range of things that might happen on any given day at any given time of year, depending on where you live, right? Depending on the general constraints of the climate in which you are operating. So news days are sort of like that, you know? Some days the sun shines, some days it snows, some days there's black ice or there's debilitating storms that bring everything to a halt. News days are like the weather. Today was a stormy day in the news cycle, which is something we are getting used to in this political climate that surrounds this unsettling presidency. But today was not just like a normal stormy day in the news in the Trump era. Today was like a whole bunch of storms stacked up one after the other. Plus there were 10 earthquakes. It's like an externality to what we usually think of as the realm of things that can affect the news cycle in any one day. Today was just nuts. It started very late last night, actually, with New York Times reporting that President Trump repeatedly within the last year has told administration officials that he wants to destroy NATO, that he wants to pull the United States out of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, which is the most important Western military alliance on Earth, and it has been for 70 years. And whether or not you think you care about NATO, I think the Times actually deserves credit for helpfully putting the importance of that kind of a decision really clearly in frame. Let me just quote from some of the Times' reporting. Quote, "There are few things that President Vladimir Putin of Russia desires more than the weakening of NATO, the military alliance among the United States, Europe, and Canada that has deterred Soviet and Russian aggression for 70 years. Senior administration officials now tell the New York Times that several times over the course of 2018, President tantamount to destroying NATO. He suggested the withdrawal of the United States from NATO." Michelle Flournoy, who was an Undersecretary of Defense during the Obama administration, she's a widely respected national security official. She'd be a top-tier candidate to be Secretary of Defense during any Democratic administration and even some Republican ones. Michelle Flournoy is then quoted in this piece by the Times saying that a move to withdraw the U.S. from NATO, quote, "would be one of the most damaging things that any president could do to U.S. interests." She continues, quote, "It would destroy 70-plus years of painstaking work across multiple administrations, Republican and Democratic, to create perhaps the most powerful and advantageous alliance in history, quote, and it would be the wildest success that Vladimir Putin could dream of." The Times continues, quote, "After Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, American national security officials believe that Russia has largely focused on undermining solidarity between the U.S. and Europe. Its goal has been to upend NATO. Russian actions toward achieving that goal have included, quote, Russia's meddling in America's elections and Russia's efforts to prevent former satellite states from joining the NATO alliance. Quote, with a weakened NATO, American officials say, Putin would have more freedom to behave as he wishes, setting up Russia as a counterweight to Europe and the United States." Senior Trump administration officials discussing the president's behavior with the Times on the condition of anonymity. They tell the paper that an American withdrawal from NATO would accomplish all that Putin has been trying to put in motion, quote, essentially doing the Russian leader's hardest and most critical work for him. So that was like midnight last night from the New York Times. And we don't know who these senior administration officials are who are talking to the New York Times about what the president has been reportedly trying to do on this front. It is possible, of course, that these are senior Trump administration officials who were concerned about these actions and these statements by the president last year, but they didn't feel the need to go to the press about them then. Maybe because Defense Secretary Jim Mattis was in place then. I mean, there's been some noise, right, that Mattis was preventing Trump from taking the worst and most reckless of his pro-Russia steps in national security and foreign policy. And again, I do not mean to suggest that I know who these sources are for the Times report, but you can tell from the substance of the reporting and also from its tone that these are very senior people who are somehow trying to pull a fire alarm here. And the timing, I think, has to be part of our understanding for why these administration officials are now coming forward and anonymously giving this information to the Times. The reporters on this piece are Julian Barnes and Helene Cooper, and they put a sort of flashing red arrow on the timing here in their report. They say, quote, "Now, the president's repeatedly stated desire to withdraw from NATO is raising new worries among national security officials amid growing concern about Mr. Trump's efforts to keep his meetings with President Putin secret from even his own aides." So I guess that's the progression. It's one thing to be a senior official in the Trump administration and to be worried or upset by the prospect that the president wants to give away the store, right? That he wants to dismember NATO. He wants to give Russia every item on its most fantastical international wish list, even the ones that would previously have been dismissed as unthinkable in this country under any leadership. So it's one thing to be opposed to that or be worried about the president's inclinations, right? But maybe you think that somebody like Jim Mattis at the Pentagon is stopping Trump from doing the worst of all those things, and so maybe you don't need to say anything to anybody about it. But it's apparently still another thing to realize that once Jim Mattis is gone, he's not there as a governor anymore. And now we find out there's really no way to know if the president is making these decisions and trying to take these actions specifically because Russia's president has been telling him directly, face to face and person to person, that this is what he needs to do. Because now we've learned that there's no record of the conversations between Trump and Putin, and it's because Trump has ensured that there are no records of those conversations. I guess that maybe is the tripwire, right? Oh, we don't know whether or not Putin has just been telling him directly to do this stuff, and he's saying, "Yes, sir, how high do you want me to jump?" I mean, maybe that's the tripwire when you swallow your pride and decide you're going to go talk to the New York Times. Maybe it's time to try to set off the alarm. I mean, it was just this weekend that Greg Miller at the Washington Post reported that Trump had confiscated and destroyed his own interpreter's notes from his meetings with Putin and had gone to great lengths to prevent other people in his administration from finding out any details about what he and Putin had talked about in multiple meetings. I mean, it may not be a coincidence that just 2 days after that report, the New York Times gets anonymous senior Trump administration officials coming to them, telling them that Trump has been trying to achieve Putin's most important and most treasured goal, the destruction of NATO, the most unimaginable thing in U.S. foreign policy. I mean, short of us dissolving ourselves, us dissolving NATO is the most fantastical dream Russia might imagine for itself. And Trump's trying to do it. And Putin, of course, is sitting pretty in a couple of different ways at this point, right? I mean, first of all, and apparently after some very careful and risky investment on his part, Putin now has a president of the United States who performs backflips on command. I mean, honestly, what else could they make him do? What else could they conceivably want from him other than what? Shutting down the U.S. government? I mean, as President Trump appears to have adopted every top-tier Russian objective in foreign policy, at least, as his own administration's position. But on top of that, the Kremlin has to be further delighted this week, right now, that this same U.S. president who does tricks on command also keeps giving Russia even more leverage over him all the time. I mean, think about it. Think about that report from the Washington Post, what the practical implications are of that from Russia's perspective, from Putin's perspective. I mean, Trump may have taken, confiscated and destroyed his own American interpreter's notes from his Putin meetings. But there's no reason to think that Putin did the same thing, right? I mean, he took notes too. There's a guy taking notes right there next to Putin. I mean, whether or not it's the Russian government's notes on these meetings between Putin and Trump, or whether they recorded those meetings, as some former senior officials have suggested Russia had a habit of doing, whether it's just notes or recordings or whatever, Russia and Vladimir Putin know the truth about what happened in those one-on-one meetings between Trump and Putin. And if they didn't know it before, now, thanks to the Washington Post, Russia knows that the truth of what happened in those one-on-one meetings between Trump and Putin, that's something that the American president, that Trump, has desperately been trying to keep from public view and even from the view of other officials in his own administration. So Russia now knows that whatever happened in those meetings, Trump is desperate to keep it secret. And they undoubtedly have a record of the truth of what happened in those meetings. That's like blackmail in a bottle. Right? Think about it. Whatever happened between Trump and Putin in those meetings, Russia knows. Russia has a record of it, and now they've got that to wield against him in case they ever need to give his leash another little tug.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.